our answer for climate should not be you, working class person, need to now invest in an electric vehicle and spend €1,000 or more to get a heat pump. We have to actually offer, what are we going to offer to the people under the banner of climate action? How can we make life easier, cheaper, and better for the working class?
Fakto uit Manifesta met Huber, Natalie Eggermont.
Today we're going to talk about climate change, class war, the working class, and how we're going to win the climate struggle. So you're Matt Huber, you're a professor in geography at Syracuse University. Mm-hmm. You wrote a lot already about climate change and how it's a class struggle. One of your latest books is Climate Change as Class Wars, which was recently also translated to Dutch. So you're a professor, but I also checked your Facebook profile and I saw that you have a daughter.
I dedicated the book to her. She was born in 2015, and I started to think about she's going to reach retirement age in 2080, and you start to look at the models and what the planet might look like in those conditions. So there was definitely some extra urgency to intervene in the climate political debate when you have a child that you're caring for. So
absolutely, it gives me the chills. I have 2 small children myself. But now let's go into politics. A lot of people are really worried about the climate, and you as well. But I understood that the thing that keeps you most awake at night is not the climate crisis in itself, but especially that we as a climate movement, we're not really winning. It's been a long time, actions, demonstrations, reports, but still it's not changing, and you're really trying to figure out why is that? Are we fighting the wrong battle? Why are we not winning? And one of your positions is that when we ask the question, who is causing the climate crisis, that we get it wrong. Can you explain?
So that's the way the book opens, is we're losing. Emissions keep going up. They went up in 2024. The book came out in 2022, and I wish I could have integrated this, because in 2022 we also saw record profits for particularly the oil and gas industry, but also coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, was booming. And the struggle is such that it seems to me that there's a class of society in the capitalist class that controls fossil fuel production, and they're pretty hell-bent on extracting as much profit from that energy source until there can be a force in society that can stop them. If you look, there's been a lot of inspiring activism, but in terms of moving the needle on emissions and phasing out fossil fuels, we're not getting it done. So we have to, I think, take a more sober analysis of the balance of power in the climate struggle and point out that we don't have a lot of power, and the people in the fossil fuel industry have way more power. So how are we going to build power? One of the arguments I make about sort of why we haven't built power is I think there's a very pernicious ideology that is sort of ever present among us, which is that the climate crisis is actually not caused by a small group of people in power, that's caused by all of us in our consumption lives, and that all of us, that climate responsibility is very diffuse throughout everyone in terms of their everyday consumption practices. And we have these tools of carbon footprint analysis that allows individuals to kind of calculate how much emissions are bound up in your practices. And this, I think, individualizing ideology has kind of really, again, sort of made the narrative really about diffuse sort of consumers kind of changing their practices, and then hopefully like through their diffuse demand will like shape production systems through consumption practices. And I think this has really been a problem. Obviously, we know that the whole idea of a carbon footprint was concocted by the very corporations that are profiting off of fossil fuels in the first place. British Petroleum, as part of their Beyond Petroleum campaign in 2004, that's 20 years ago, and we're still not beyond petroleum. They came up with, like this carbon footprint quiz to show how you can pitch in to solve climate change, which I think deflects attention away from them. When I really started to think about climate change as a class problem, I recognized that a lot of people were starting to think about it as a problem of kind of inequality and what is sometimes called carbon inequality. People like Thomas Piketty and Oxfam International have done these analyses that show, the rich have much higher carbon emissions. And that analysis is really based on the same methodology, looking at people's consumption carbon footprints. And I thought, well, that's not a very Marxist analysis of class, because it's very much the class analysis there is really about what your income is and how your income leads to particular consumption practices. And obviously, we know from a Marxist perspective, class is not really about consumption, it's about production. It's about who has the power to organize production, who owns and profits from the means of production. In that case, if we redirect attention to the perpetrators of the climate crisis, to the actual owners and investors that actually control and organize and have the power to decide how we organize our energy systems, that is actually, I think, a more productive political narrative to really focus on. That's really not all of us that are causing this. It's the people that are really making the money off this energy system. So I try to make the point that even, a rich person who has a high carbon footprint might not, be someone that actually, as their role as an investor, an owner, and a capitalist, actually is driving emissions on that part of their realm, which they're honestly going to spend more time in their lives doing, like organizing. I'd give an example of a fossil fuel executive will probably spend 8 to 10 hours a day trying to organize a global network of fossil fuel extraction. And then maybe for a couple hours, they might eat a steak or drive a fuel inefficient vehicle. But somehow the politics only focuses responsibility on those 1 to 2 hours of consumption life, and we don't focus on their role as owners and profiteers. And again, I think this is a better political narrative because it really makes clear that actually most of us don't have power over how these energy systems are organized. The working class under capitalism has very little power over production. We are forced to sell our labor power in exchange for a wage just to survive. And in that, we relinquish our freedom over how these production systems are organized. And that is, as people would call it, production is organized kind of like a dictatorship where capitalists really dictate how these systems are organized and the workers just have to follow orders. And so the mass majority of society doesn't have this kind of power over our electrical system, over our energy system, over transport and housing, all these infrastructures that we need to transform. The political narrative, a more Marxist class analysis of climate change would say it's really a minority of society that's causing the problem, and we need to organize power to wrestle control away from them, to take sort of more social and public control over these energy systems, to direct them towards this real civilizational goal of decarbonization that's going to take a lot of change to our infrastructures and to our energy system, and it's going to require a lot of power to accomplish.
So that means that because now a lot of the climate campaigns from British Petrol, but also government and NGOs and in schools, are a lot about creating awareness with the idea that if people understand what climate change is about, that they will change their behavior. And you say that's still linked to behavior, and it's really a question about who has power in society. So all of this is besides the question. Or how do you see it?
Yeah, there's a sort of folksy saying that knowledge is power, which can be true to a point, but I have a section of the book where I say knowledge is not power because we've known about climate change. The science has been clear. Some would trace it back over a century, actually, where people started to come to grips with what we now call the greenhouse effect. But even in the 1960s, in the United States, the presidential administration of Lyndon Johnson was doing studies on the greenhouse effect. We know ExxonMobil knew. They did their own research in the 1970s. And then wider public awareness really takes off in the 1980s. So we've had this knowledge. We've been talking about what the science is saying. But one of the arguments of the book is that a lot of the climate activists and the climate movement are kind of coming from what I call the professional class, highly educated layers of society. Their whole class project is about using credentials to kind of carve out advantages in the labor market, getting degrees and credentials and licenses and so forth. And so from that class position, it makes sense that knowledge is important, education is important. So that's why in the United States, these types of people, they had a march for science, when Trump was in power, because Trump is kind of obviously the attack on truth, the attack on facts. To make a long story short, we've known about the climate crisis for so long. We keep trying to say if only people believed the science, right, then action would inevitably follow. But I think this is a very problematic and liberal theory of change that just if we inform society, if we inform our political leaders of the science, of the truth, then action just naturally follows. I mean, that's not the kind of democracy we live in. We live in a capitalist state system where wealth and power and corporations have skewed power over the political process, and it's going to take a lot more than knowledge to win against them, right? It's going to take real sort of mass action and mass power. And obviously the science is terrifying and it's really waking us up to the urgency, but we can't really bank our politics being on just believe the science, right?
You said earlier that people are actually quite powerless. In a way, you can choose what you buy, but we cannot choose what is produced and how it's produced. And this is really these choices, it's just a handful of people that are making them. So the real problem is that such a small elite has actual power over society, and that all of this is privately owned.
Yeah.
That's where the problem is.
In some cases there could be public ownership that's not particularly accountable to the people, so that could be the case as well. But capitalism really is a system where a lot of people like to celebrate we have choices. In the labor market where we work, we can quit if we feel too exploited, but we also, obviously, capitalist ideologues will always celebrate our choice in the market to consume whatever products we desire. And I think this, though, does obscure that, again, for 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, most of us as working class people relinquish our freedom of choice and go into the workplace where we work under a dictatorship where all the choice is gone and the power to organize production is in the hands of a very small elite. People want to feel agency, and they want to feel like their choices in the market matter, and they're actually having an influence. And I don't want to tell people they aren't. And obviously I do this, and all of us try in our lives to kind of think about the carbon implications of our consumption. But I think we have to come to grips with the fact that in that realm of consumption, we aren't able to organize the kind of power to transform these systems at the scale and speed that we need to. But to actually decarbonize at scale, we need power over massive investments in new infrastructures, new energy systems. And that's not just going to become from atomized consumer decisions, sort of voting with their wallets to make this. It's really public works challenge of the 21st century. It's going to mean massive redistribution of wealth from the capitalist class to fund investment in public infrastructure. And that has to come with organizing, right? And that's kind of how I see this struggle. It's really at that level of societal power that we need to see.
It's a class war. That's
Yes.
why that's what we're coming to.
Yeah.
It's very clear because it's not convincing others to change behavior, but we're actually fighting the most powerful companies in the world. So it's about taking their power away. It's a real class struggle, and then we need a mass movement. But you see a particular role for the working class?
It's, again, coming from a very Marxist analysis that says there's one force in society that has sort of the capacity to build this kind of objective power. And Marx famously said that capitalism creates its own grave diggers through, really, capitalism sort of rises up through this process of creating a working class by what Marx called proletarianization, sort of tearing the peasantry and land-based subsistence people, tearing them from the land, forcing them to survive via a market where they have to work for a wage. And of course, we know that capitalists rely on that proletariat to do the work in their enterprises, and as Marx showed, they exploit those workers to create the profits that fund their entire enterprises. The Marxist analysis is that in that process of creating this mass working class, you create this mass collective, organized group of people that have this sort of objective power that no other force in society has. It actually had this sort of role, this agency in a capitalist system that could really bring the system to its knees because of its power. And its power is in many facets. The first is that just on a basic level, this process of proletarianization creates this sort of majority of society that has to rely on a wage to survive. And this vast majority of working class people is really the majority of society. So if we're going to build a mass movement, if we're going to build a majoritarian movement, we have to figure out how to reach this sort of working class. I would add that we really need to think about the working class in a sort of lower layers of society. I think even if in a country like mine, in the United States, if you do an analysis that kind of takes out the more privileged layers like professionals or managers, small business owners, you still come to something like 60 to 70% of the population is in this more precarious working class that lives on a day-to-day level in this kind of proletarian insecurity. People really are struggling to access basic things like housing, like healthcare, and, as you all know, energy. And this kind of proletarian insecurity creates this mass force in society that also, because of this insecurity baked into capitalism, has this kind of material interest in transformative change, because life under capitalism is really exhausting and terrible and stressful. And I think Marxists have always known that if we can kind of channel and organize that inherent anger and at the system that people have, we can sort of build this kind of mass power through the working class. But the most important thing that the working class has is the fact that they do the work in society. They do do the labor that society depends on, and therefore if they withdraw their labor, if they go on strike, they can actually create a crisis and force those in power and elites to kind of answer to a set of demands. And no other force in society really has that leverage. I talk in the book a bit about school strikes, and they're very inspiring. And, it's students not going to school on Fridays. It's really cool. And I think, again, morally, educationally, a beautiful type of activism. But they're not shutting down the school systems in a way that creates leverage, creates power. In West Virginia in 2018, teachers went on strike, the actual workers that run the schools, and they shut down the whole schooling system in West Virginia. And they're in a very right-wing state with reactionary politicians. But by creating that crisis, they were able to win their very progressive demands in this right-wing state within 2 weeks. And so that's the power that working class people have. We just saw it with the UAW and their stand-up strike. At one point, General Motors had admitted that they had lost $800 million because of these strikes that were targeted to particular facilities. So you can put pressure on corporations, you can put pressure on politicians to answer to a set of demands when you use this power that workers have to go on strike and force the issue.
They have the best weapon because they can hurt the powerful where it hurts the most. Exactly. With their profits. Yeah.
Yes.
So we talked about how the working class is really crucial. So that brings us to the challenge how we're going to mobilize them, because it's really not so easy with the elections. I've talked to a lot of factory workers, and they're not always so keen, sometimes anti-environment, because they feel it's all about taxes and making life even more difficult for them. So how do we solve that?
To me, if you go back to kind of basics in terms of how Marx defines the working class under capitalism, it is a class that's really separated from the means of production. But the most important means of production that Marx emphasizes is the land, and the fact that it's really a world historical new thing that the vast majority of society has actually been violently alienated from the ecological conditions of existence, which means for most of human history, all of us, to make a living, most of us produced our own subsistence on land, through the land. And of course, there was various forms of ecological stewardship that came through that kind of subsistence economy. And then capitalism comes around and you get the privatization of land, you get people in the enclosure of the commons, and the peasantry destroyed and proletarianized. And so this is a deeply ecological process that creates a majority population of humans under capitalism who are really alienated from ecology and from the ecological means of life. And they have to access the means of life now through the market, right? And as we've seen with what is called a cost of living crisis, which I would say that's like an ecological assault on life itself, working class life, people are really struggling to access the very basic stuff of life, food and housing and transport and energy. I make the case that if we actually orient our politics toward this kind of proletarian insecurity, we could build a climate program that is actually about decarbonizing all these core sectors of basic working class needs, like food and energy and housing and transport, and orienting those sectors toward giving people more secure access, if not decommodified access to those basic needs as part of a larger climate program. And that, I think, would really speak to the material interest of not just factory workers, but all working class people, whether they work in retail or service industries or factories or wherever. Most working class people are struggling to make ends meet in this very unequal and barbaric capitalist economy. And I think our answer for climate should not be you, working class person, need to now invest in an electric vehicle and spend €1,000 or more to get a heat pump. We have to actually offer, what are we going to offer to the people under the banner of climate action? How can we make life easier, cheaper, and better for the working class? And again, I think that type of politics is not really foregrounding the science and the knowledge of the climate crisis. It's really just trying to meet people more in the material everyday existence. You probably remember the yellow vests in France. They had this slogan that politicians only want us to care about the end of the world, but we're trying to get to the end of the month. I think climate politics more generally has really struggled to meet working class people at that end of month level. A more radical spin on that slogan was end of the month, end of the world, same struggle. And I like that. In both those domains, we're kind of up against the same forces, which is capitalists who are really making our end of the months worse. And they're basically hell bent on burning the planet down, trying to really orient climate action around the end of the month struggles, which I think is very possible because, again, those are the sectors we really need to decarbonize. But I think, again, that would require building kind of social power to, again, wrestle away some of the social surplus to invest in public goods, in public provision of things like housing and energy, and really trying to take back some of that provision from the capitalists. And it's going to require things like political parties that you have here in Belgium that are building power and building kind of strategy to kind of reorient these sectors towards the working class. And so it's hard work. Obviously, there's a more sort of union-based strategy that I can talk about too, but that's more the kind of general strategy.
Yeah, but maybe just first, because in terms of politics, I have the idea that there's really two different kind of takes. Either you go towards the more individual, and then you have carbon taxing because you want to make everything that is not good for the climate, want to make it more expensive, and then people will make the right choice. Or you say, okay, we're going to a massive public investment program for housing, energy, transport, and all these things, which will make life better for a lot of people, which will create jobs, but it actually also requires real big investments. So it's really two different kinds of politics.
Instead of like this narrative, we're going to make fossil fuels more expensive and internalize the cost of climate change into the price mechanism. Economists love this idea. They think it's really cool because they say climate change is a market failure, and the market has failed to see the cost of emissions and the cost of climate change. So we'll just correct that failure by implementing this carbon tax that internalizes the price of the emissions into the price of all the goods we see, and then voila, the economy just naturally guides itself toward clean energy, and everyone's happy. But as the Yellow Vest showed, if you make your entire policy framework around raising the cost of a key input in everyday life, which is energy. There's been ways to kind of redistribute the revenue of the carbon tax in progressive ways, but ultimately the right wing is able to look at these types of policies that put the onus on working people to kind of internalize these costs. They just say this is just more climate liberals and leftists who are trying to make your life worse, who are trying to dictate down what you can do. And to me, it's really the opposite of trying to build a more popular mass politics. Because if we're going to win power in nominally democratic societies, we have to make our policies like really popular, like really attractive. And carbon taxes, they're popular amongst economists, but they've tried to vote in carbon taxes in the United States and the state of Washington, and it gets hammered in the polls. People they're not inspired by carbon taxes. So it's not, I don't think, a platform for building this kind of mass popular climate politics.
You said that it's actually pushing people towards the extreme right?
Yeah, I think it's very popular amongst middle, upper class, climate aware, technocratic type, policy-minded, not just economists, right? There's a whole kind of climate intelligentsia who, I argue in the book, a lot of middle class people have this anxiety about their own carbon footprint, their own consumption, and they feel like they're complicit in the kind of relations of climate breakdown. And so they love this idea, like if we could make fossil fuels cost more, it will force everyone to kind of internalize that anxiety and move towards more behavioral changes of consuming less energy, keeping the thermostat down lower, driving less, but also not flying, these types of things. And so they think this would be great. This is what I want. I want to be more frugal and more carbon aware in my life. But they don't, I think broadly about not everyone is a middle, upper class, comfortable person that is sort of looking to see how they can improve their carbon footprint. Most people are actually just struggling to meet their basic needs. And this idea that we're going to solve climate change through technocratic changes to your individual lives, I think a lot of people react very negatively to that. So I think that professional class needs to sort of get out of their own heads sometimes and think more broadly and strategically about how this politics is channeled in the larger society.
You also said that we shouldn't tax carbon molecules, but we should just tax the rich and then use the money to improve people's lives.
So this used to be the major demand on the left. We should not tax molecules. We should tax the rich. I wanted there to be bumper stickers. It never really took off.
We can make a t-shirt also.
But to me, again, the idea of a carbon tax is sort of politically neutral. It feels politically neutral. All of us rely on carbon in some way in our lives. And again, the right is able to say that this is a tax on your life. It's a tax on how you live. But tax the rich is again, this traditional left working class demand that the rich are stealing all this wealth from our labor and all this wealth from society, that we need to take it back through the redistribution of wealth from them to us, right? And instead of this, again, very technocratic vision of internalizing the cost of externalities, we have a vision of a really antagonistic vision that in order to improve the lives of everyone in society, we really need to fight the small part of society that steals all the wealth, and we need to tax them and redistribute it into public goods and actually building out the infrastructure to save the climate, because capitalists are clearly not willing to invest in that type of project. So we got to take the wealth from them to do so.
And then very concretely, some ideas that we could do. We have the Green New Deal in the US. We with the PvdA, we also have a campaign, Do the Switch, where we also say, okay, take the money from the rich and then we can really invest in, for example, public transport, make it free, really good public transport, so people, you don't have to tax the car, but just have good public transport, widespread insulation of houses, public energy, taking it back under democratic control and making it cheaper. So you get cheap energy, cheap housing, free public transport. It will make life much better. You also need so much people to make all this. It will create an enormous amount of jobs. It will stop the deindustrialization of Europe. So these are, I think, quite concrete things that people could inspire, that we could mobilize for, right?
Yeah, that's the way to do it for sure. Very inspiring.
Do you know any good examples already of mobilizations around public energy or transport? Or
it's a very small example, but in Boston, Massachusetts, there was a mayor who won election under the banner. She called herself a Green New Deal mayor, and she did experiment with basically making public transit free and working in particularly working class communities. And they've seen through that program that ridership has increased, and it is very popular. I was recently in San Francisco, and the land of Silicon Valley and tech titans of capitalism. If you ever just want to understand the vast inequalities of capitalism, this is a center of so much wealth in the world. I also saw just countless homeless encampments, just visible poverty everywhere in this richest of city. There's a housing crisis. People can't afford to live in housing in the richest city, in the richest country in the world. And one thing, I wanted to visit some comrades, socialists, who were going to have a meeting. And I was near the airport in San Francisco, and I had to get to Oakland. And I took their public transit system, and it cost me $22 round trip for just going within this sort of urban region. And so you think about, again, the working class people who are not even able to afford rent and have to pay those types of fares for transit. It just doesn't make sense. People would rather drive a beat up car around town if they're forced to pay those fares. So just going back to basics and really making public transit more affordable. We know public transit is more ecologically sound, so we would try to build our cities to be more conducive to that kind of collective consumption in the transport realm. But to do so, we have to make it cheap, if not free, and we have to really make it easy for people to want to take that ecological choice, if you will. We have a good example not so far from here in France, in Dunkerque. It's also free, and it's been for a long time, and so now they evaluate it, and much more people are using public transport, and now the next step they want to do is also have more transport at night in the early morning for people that have to go the early shift, the night shift. Because I'm a medic, and when I finish my night shift, there's no bus home, so even if I wanted to leave my car, I can, because I don't have a bus. And so they're thinking about also to have much more transport also to industrial sites, because often there's a bus connecting the city center with schools of stuff, but not to go to the industrial site. So it's really interesting to see how it's developing, and now they're trying to focus on getting people to work early, late at night with the bus. So there are some good examples, I think, indeed. Yeah. And to create this mass movement, now we talked a bit about which kind of politics do we need, like really visionary, mobilizing, but we also really should
organize concretely?
The kind of Green New Deal vision, I think, is more for political parties to organize a sort of vast program that could be implemented at a societal level. But obviously, decarbonization is also very specific to the industrial sector. I, in the book, really talk a lot about electricity. It's really sort of the linchpin of decarbonization. We need to kind of clean up the electric sector and then electrify other parts. I really do think as socialist and labor-oriented people, we need to look at these sectors of the energy system and the electricity sector, but also what we call the building trades, construction jobs, who are the actual workers that are going to build all this new infrastructure. I think we need to sort of center those workers as being the sort of strategic center of this new vast building project. Because again, we sort of have a sense that the green transition is happening, but we're still a society globally that relies on 80% of its energy from fossil fuels. So the amount of investment in infrastructure building that needs to take place to actually solve the problem is enormous. Again, I said civilizational type of, some people call it a third industrial revolution. So I think, again, and if capitalists are not really willing to make those investments, it's going to have to come through some other social force. And I think these workers in building trades and electricity unions and energy unions, if they sort of organize and realize that they could have a stake in this transition and that it could be a transition that expands their jobs, their membership, their livelihoods through this kind of vast build out of clean infrastructure, then I think you could build that kind of power that's calling for this vast expansion and investment in public goods. And I've come to think it really what we need is just a more sort of broader, not just a climate movement, but a broader kind of anti-capitalist and anti-austerity movement that's just, again, trying to fight back from the many decades we've faced of neoliberal austerity and saying we need a full-scale investment in public goods, not just climate-related, like things like healthcare and education, and transport and energy and public energy, as you mentioned. And I think the workers that will build those investments have a lot to gain from that. So if they can get behind and build up that kind of power to pressure the state and other actors for that kind of large-scale investment, I think they're uniquely positioned. One of the struggles we've had as a climate movement in particular is we often in our activism focus on the things we don't like about society, which is the things we need to shut down, like coal mines and fossil fuel extraction and pipelines. And that's great, and we do need that. A lot of that activism is like very morally righteous and courageous. But that kind of activism often does antagonize some of these industrial workers that are in those sectors who are just trying to get by. I think this more proactive, this more positive climate politics of building the infrastructure we need, it will have natural allies in the labor unions, in these, particularly these industrial unions, the very workers we need to build this new world. And so I think that kind of politics really has a lot of potential.
Yeah, I think it's really inspiring because some right-wing people, they often say that like these climate bohos, they just want to go back to the times where we lived in a cage and we didn't have anything and we're going to ruin all the economy and all the factories are going to shut down, is what I often hear. And I think it's really good that we can bring an inspiring vision about actually we're going to rebuild society and it's going to be more, but more better, not just more for profit, but more for saving the climate and making lives better. And in the process that we're doing it, we're going to build power and also get power back, give the power back to the people, not just in terms of energy, but just democratically, and that we're in the end going to be the ones that are going to decide which energy we make, what we produce, and for whom.
We live in a world, particularly in the global north, that's gone through this world historical process called industrialization. It's really been dramatic what's happened to our societies, where even in the United States, something like 40% of the labor force still worked in agriculture in 1900, and now it's 1.5%. So you have these highly industrialized societies. But I think through this process of industrialization, we've created a lot of layers of society that are so really physically and geographically separated from these industrial systems that really we all rely on, and we're separated from the workers that do the work in these systems. And that has, I think, led to, particularly again amongst this more professional class, climate left, a kind of sort of blanket kind of anti-industrial politics. Again, we're just going to sort of shut down, sort of the very term industrialization is seen as a bad term, and in some cases it very much is. It can be very nasty, very dirty stuff, but we all rely on on industrial systems of provision, and the challenge of climate change is how we can transform those systems into decarbonized systems, and that's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of workers, and I think that vision has much more capacity to really win over those workers.
Thank you for a really inspiring talk, and I hope that soon we're going to have big climate strikes, and then you can come visit again, and I'll make you the t-shirt with the carbon molecules, tax the rich.
See if it sells.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.